Greetings. This lecture is on crisis management, and specifically we're moving to the place where we have gone from more programmed decisions where we know that there's certainty and we know what our decision choices are, we know the probabilities of those outcomes, and now we're moving towards situations that are primarily ambiguous, where a crisis occurs, we're really not sure what happened, why it happened, and we have to make a lot of strategic decisions in the moment to deal with those issues. So crises can be anything from crisis of reputation to crisis of natural disaster. It could be crisis of terrorism. It could be any number of things, and we'll go through that list in a little bit. So moving to your next slide, I encourage you to take a look at those two videos. One is the old standard duck and cover video that they used to train people back in the 1950s on how to be prepared for a nuclear war. And of course, we understand that context. It's very simple science, simple technology. But it took a very simplistic solution to how do we get ourselves ready for the nuclear disaster. I mean, clearly ducking and covering is not going to save us if a nuclear bomb is coming. And that's kind of what the Lewis Black video at the bottom gets at. If you're not interested in something that's a little risque, I wouldn't say risque, that's probably not appropriate, but probably more R-rated language, as it says there. Don't listen to it. But if you're okay with the R-rated language, Lewis Black talking about duck and cover, duct tape, nuclear attacks, these are sort of interesting. And he is talking about it in context to how George Bush had encouraged us to be prepared for biological warfare, biological attacks right after 9/11. So it was sort of interesting to see how they thought about that. Anyway, so that is some videos that you should watch if you have time. If you don't feel comfortable watching Lewis Black, by all means, no worries about that. Moving on to the next slide, where we talk about disaster preparedness. What are some potential disasters? We've got everything on this list here from dam failure to winter storms. And the thing that you need to be aware of is any one of these things could even happen here in the St. Louis area. Certainly there could be dam failure, although that's less likely and less of an issue. But it could certainly happen at smaller local levels. It's not like the Hoover Dam, right? Where something big is going down, but it's smaller. Earthquakes are a big deal here and can be a big deal. People are preparing for the New Madras fault to blow one more time. The last time I think it had an issue was 2008. So we certainly need to keep that into consideration. Floods are a big deal here. Fire can attack anybody at any time. There's a lot of railroads that go through this general area, so certainly hazardous materials being leaked is an issue. We've got refineries along the Mississippi River. There could be hazardous materials leaked there as well. Hurricanes are really not an issue here. Neither are landslides, but extreme heat can be. Nuclear power plants can be. Terrorism and bioterrorism always could be. Thunderstorms, tornadoes, absolutely. Tsunamis, maybe not so much. Volcano, probably not so much. But absolutely we could run into issues with winter storms, whether it's a blizzard or whether it is just an ice storm, which is what we're more normally used to in this area. These are things that we need to think about. And some of these things we can plan for. Some of the things we can actually be prepared for and have a plan in place to deal with it. And a lot of the natural disasters, we know that these can happen, so we can be prepared in case something occurs and have a procedure for handling that. But there are some things we can't plan for. We can't plan for a nuclear power plant emergency. We can't plan for bioterrorism. And while we can't necessarily plan for when a tornado comes, we certainly know how to deal with it in the aftermath. I mean, we have enough research out there, particularly for people that live in the tornado belt here, that we're pretty clear about how we can handle it. But we're not used to earthquakes. We don't have really good plans in place for how to deal with earthquakes. I don't think people really plan for the hazardous material things. And so again, these are concerns that we have to address and be prepared for. Moving on to the next slide, FEMA has traditionally been involved in helping businesses and people and businesses to recover after a crisis, after some sort of disaster. And one of the things that they recognized after some research was done, they realized that American businesses don't plan for disasters, whether they're man-made disasters or natural disasters. They don't plan well for them, and they don't recover. Small businesses particularly are hit the hardest. They make up a huge percentage of the nation's payroll, and they represent a large chunk of the types of businesses that exist in the world, and well, certainly in the U.S. And what we're seeing is if small businesses don't prepare for disasters or have a good plan in place, they're going to run into a lot of problems. And in the end, they may not survive a disaster, regardless of whether it's man-made or natural. So again, small businesses really need to invest an enormous amount of money into recovery plans, emergency plannings, things like that. And as it says in sort of the next slide, you have to be prepared. You have to get involved. You cannot put these kinds of things on the back burner. It may feel like, why are we planning for something that may never happen? This is how you plan for the unexpected. You have a plan in place that you know if something occurs, you at least have a standard operating procedure that you can go to be able to help your company survive these sorts of things. And after 9/11, employers had really no good idea how to contact their employees, where to have their employees set up as a backup plan, where data backup should be. These were considerations that a lot of employers put a lot of thought into because no one ever thought that a disaster would happen. So suddenly, when you're facing, a major issue that's unprecedented, you never thought it would ever happen, you don't have a plan in place to manage it. It may seem like a lot of effort for a small probability, but keep in mind that if it does happen, you are in a situation where you haven't any preparation, and then the chances of you surviving it are going to be fairly slim. A little bit of investment of time up front makes it a lot more likely that you will survive later on. Now, does that mean that every company has business discontinuation insurance? It'd be great if you could. Small businesses probably can't afford the cost of that, but it doesn't mean that you can't have some kind of plan in place for how to deal with disasters as they pop up. So in the next slide, for small businesses, it is really important that they have a good plan in place because a fourth of them don't survive a disaster. My favorite Chinese restaurant in Lower Manhattan never reopened after 9/11, and it had been around for over a decade that I knew of, and I'm sure longer than that, and had great, cheap, really good tasting Chinese food. And because they were a cash business and because they were closed down for so long, they lost an enormous amount of business. They couldn't stay open and they failed. So these sorts of things do happen. So it is important. All businesses, large or small, but particularly small businesses, really focus on how they can be prepared for a disaster and have a plan in place to address that. In terms of disaster plans, obviously you want your plan to be as comprehensive as possible based on the things that are going to be the highest probability of occurring. Certainly things like floods are a big deal here. Things like earthquakes could be a big deal here because we don't have the same kind of preparation as they do, say, in California or in Alaska, or areas where disasters like earthquakes happen more frequently, but it doesn't mean that we can't still be prepared for it. Tornadoes absolutely happen all the time. Fire can happen. And certainly it may not be a wildfire like you might see in the West, but we still have issues with structural fires. And that's why we have fire drills all the time, right? And we have tornado drills all the time. These are things that we have to be prepared for. Here in the state of Illinois, there is the thing called the Springfield Emergency Response. And what they do is they work with managers and emergency responders to help them get ready for disasters. So you can actually work with them for training opportunities, to bring in people to help you get prepared for disaster. But they're your resource. They're your go-to here in the state of Illinois. One of the things that a lot of crisis management plans recommend is making a shelter in place. Why would you want a shelter in place? Well, if there is a hazard, a chemical hazard disaster, or a nuclear power plant disaster, some sort of something going on outside where it might be hazardous to be outside of your building, you build a shelter in place so that you have a safe place for people to go to be protected. And this can even be in the situation of if there's a tornado that runs through the area that you're working in, right? You don't want people going out in their cars, driving through a horrible place that's just been decimated by, a tornado, because you don't know what's going on with storms, and they could pop up and change direction at any time. So you create a shelter for people to be able to be there. And so you have to have a plan in place to be able to manage that shelter. A couple things that you need to be aware of. You should have a warning system of some sort, whatever that might be, whether it's a telephone system or an internal alarm system or email system, whatever it is. But you need to have a warning system in place so people know what's going on and knowing that they need to disappear and manage that. You need to know who's in your building and who's not. That was one of the big issues after 9/11, is people realized they didn't know who was in their building. They didn't know where people were. There was no check-in or check-out procedure. So you should know who's in your building and who's not, who's absent and who's not. Are there guests? Are there vendors? Are there customers? And what are you going to do to support them? Because if something happens, obviously we need to be able to help them as well. So we don't know if somebody's, crushed under a shelf, or if they might be stuck in a corner in a room with no exit. We need to know where people are at all times. Along with having this warning system and knowing who's in your building, you've got to be able to test these systems, just like we do monthly fire alarms and monthly tornado alarms. We also need to do monthly tests of whatever system we put in place to get people into shelters. And also, we also need to make sure in developing our plan that we have a plan in place for people who, A, don't speak English, because we may have customers or people who work for us that don't speak English well, or they may have a hearing impairment, and so we need to be prepared for that as well. Moving on to the next slide, in terms of other things to consider for a shelter-in plan, is making sure, again, that you have all your people, workers, visitors, customers, all accounted for. So having a check-in system. It's not because you're trying to poke into privacy, but you need to know who is where and when and why and how to manage them. You want to make sure you've got a head count as you start to gather people in an area, or you're trying to recover. You want to make sure you've got that head count ready to go. You want to make sure that you've got, if you have, and you can develop it, have a roster or a checklist that you manage. Now, again, why would you want a checklist? Of course, we've talked about in other material in this class how important it is to have a checklist, because when you're in a crisis, your attention gets narrowed and focused, and you forget things very easily. Things that you would normally do routinely is very easy to forget. So having a very good roster or checklist that you can go through to make sure things get done is imperative. So that needs to be set up, laminated somewhere, so the person who might be, the safety officer for that floor or for that building can grab it, and they can work through that checklist to make sure people are in place and people are safe, and we've gone through and we make sure we've got our good head count and everybody's got water, and we're good to go. One thing you need to know from a legal perspective is you cannot force people to go into a shelter. If they don't want to go, they don't have to go. You don't have to force people to go out on a fire drill. That's their business. You cannot force people to participate in those drills, nor can you force them to go into a shelter if they choose not to. Is it in their best interest? Of course, and that's part of the messaging and the culture that you need to develop. But the bottom line is you cannot force them legally to go into it. Other things that you want to do to get your shelter in place plan going. Having a good checklist of people's duties. So everybody, besides not just your safety officer with a master checklist, but everybody who has a role to play should have some sort of checklist to go through the things that they need to do. One person may be responsible for water. Another person may be responsible for taking attendance. Another person is responsible for coordinating calls to families. I mean, there could be any number of things that you would want to do. And it's up to the company to decide what are the most important things that they want to accomplish, in these duties, and make sure that everybody knows what their duties are. Just like we have a fire safety officer for each floor in a building, we have a shelter in place officer, or a sort of a shelter officer in place that helps people to get to their shelter and to deal with all the issues they need to deal with. As the next item, I've already sort of mentioned this, getting your emergency supply kits ready. And those supply kits need to include some food, but most important is to have water. It's very important that you've got water that's available so that people can drink. So you can go without food for a few days, but it's really difficult to go without water for a period of time. And you don't know what kind of crisis you're going to face. So it is important that we have supply kits with candles, flashlights, batteries, blankets, first aid material, some food if we can, most importantly, water, anything to make sure, tarps to keep us protected in case there's issues with, windows that are blown out or walls that are blown out. And the most important thing that we can do is make sure that we practice this plan regularly so that we're ready to go and that there's no issues when a problem arises. In terms of managing disaster plans, it's really helpful to coordinate with other businesses that might share the building with you or share a complex with you or in your general area. If a disaster happens in a large scale in your area, being able to coordinate with other employers and other businesses will be very helpful. So sharing information is a good idea, and practicing things together. You should also be working with your first responders, with Springfield if you're here in the Illinois side of the river, any kind of community organizers or community experts on disaster management, and really work with them to develop your plan. They will come in and advise you, they will consult with you to get a plan set up and make it work. It's also really important that you constantly are in contact with your suppliers, the people who do the shipping for you, your customers, anybody that you do business with, upstream and downstream, to make sure that they know what's going on and that you have a plan in place for how to manage a disaster if you cannot manage it anymore. For example, if you have a crisis, but you've got stuff leaving a distributor and it has to be shipped to clients, it doesn't have to go through your office. You can probably drop ship to your clients directly instead. Or if you've got a crisis at your location and you can't deal with customer phone calls, you forward the phone calls to another office or to another location. So find ways, to manage this. Annually, what should you be doing to manage your disaster plans? You want to make sure that you are revising and reviewing those plans on a regular basis. You make sure that you are making, when you make changes, that people are updated on what those changes look like. You need to make sure that you have new people who are brought on board that are aware of your disaster plans, because it's really easy to say, oh, well, we trained everybody, and then kind of forget that the new person that was hired 4 months later may not know that plan, and they may be running around and be unclear about, what's going on in terms of how to manage things. Another thing that you want to be thinking about is how to encourage your employees to have their own disaster plans for home. How do they prepare their family? How do they make sure that their family is taken care of? And here's the nice thing about this, to think about this in this way. When your employees know that their family is safe and sound, they can get back to the business of helping the company survive the disaster, whatever that is. So it is important for people to say, is my family okay? Great. They have their meals, they have their water, they have a place to be, they're safe and sound. Now I can help my business recover and get back to things. And I can completely relate to that. My own 9/11 experience, the first thing I wanted to do was make sure my mother, who was at Newark Airport, had not taken off and that she was fine, that my daughter was safe and sound at school and I didn't have to worry about that, and that my spouse at the time was safe and sound at home and not running around. So those are the things that you know and you want to check in on first. When those things are fine, then you can focus on your own issues that you've got to deal with in terms of preparedness or reacting to the crisis you're dealing with, or helping your company to deal with whatever issues they need to deal with. So whether it's a company-related issue or your family-related issue, getting these things off the plate and knowing that really now everybody's safe and sound. Now all I can do, what I need to do is focus on, my company and what we need to do to get back up and running properly. So your plan has to be inclusive. You want to make sure that you've got a plan that takes into account people's who have illnesses or disabilities of some sort, whether it's a hearing disability, a sight disability, health disabilities, people who might have diabetes that need regular medicine, any one of those sorts of things. It's important to kind of assess the strengths and weaknesses of your employees when it comes to giving jobs to people. The last thing you want to do is give to someone who gets very hypersensitive to stuff, or who may be emotional in terms of responding to things, to give them a job where they have to stay calm, cool, and collected. And there are some people that are just better suited for disaster management than others. And so you want to make sure that you are handling that accordingly. Everyone can and should contribute, but you've got to figure out what are people's strengths and weaknesses around that specific issue. This is a big issue. Communication has to happen in a disaster and can be challenging to do in a disaster. The communication fails are part of the issues that compound the problems when you're in a disaster. So always plan for the fact that communication is not going to be readily done. Have backup plans in place for communication. You can't always assume that your cell phones are going to work. On 9/11, all the cell phone towers were on top of the towers that fell. So you couldn't use your cell phone to call people very easily because the signals had to bounce to other antenna, and then suddenly you had a larger jam up of people trying to go through antennas to be able to get calls out. So it was a big issue. One of the things my ex-husband did in Lower Manhattan was to get the telecom up and running for the stock exchanges and the Federal Reserve banks and things like that, making sure that we could get businesses up and running again. And he was responsible for figuring out how to get mobile antennas in and how to get mobile cell phone coverage in. And so he brought in all sorts of antennas and things to get business up and running. And if we couldn't get businesses up and running, the economy would have ground to a halt worse than it already did. So always have some sort of backup plan. And that backup plan is not just about the communication and how you're going to communicate, but who you have to communicate to. For example, in terms of suppliers, shippers, customers, who's going to make the phone calls to those people, letting them know what's going on and letting them know how you're going to divert supplies or people or services to your customers. So you do need to make sure that you have a plan in place for what you're going to communicate and to whom you'll be communicating it. Moving on to the next slide is the cyber problems in terms of keeping your computer safe. Do you have a cyber expert on site that knows how to deal with cyber crimes or cyber disasters and things like that? Do you have a backup person for that person in case something happens to that original person? Do you have a backup plan for where your data is? And what are you going to do if your system's compromised? What are you going to do if somebody breaks into your system and says, we've compromised all your data, we've stolen all your, your credit cards and your social security numbers. Where do you go from here? And this is cybercrime and cyber problems are a growing phenomenon, and they're not going to get better and before they get worse. So it's important that you spend an enormous amount of time focusing on, how to address all the cyber issues in your company, so you have a plan in place to manage that or to shut things down as quickly as possible if you've got a breach somewhere. In managing a crisis, it's always important that you have a plan in place to communicate, but part of that plan in place means asking some hard questions before you open up your mouth. Number one, what did we know? Number two, when did we know it? And number three, what are we going to do about it? So we need to know what we know, and we need to be able to say when we knew what something occurred. Because when you have a crisis, whether it's crisis of terrorism or crisis of a natural disaster, people are clamoring for information. Everybody's clamoring for information. The public's clamoring for it. Your company is clamoring for it. Customers, suppliers, your board, everybody's clamoring for info. So you need to know what you know, when did you know it, and what are you going to do about it. Stakeholders are key, and you need to have somebody that is going to talk with all of those key stakeholders, somebody who's assigned to your board, somebody who's assigned to other investors, to customers and clients, to advertising agencies. And there's just a whole variety of stakeholders that you really need to consider in context. So it's important that we deal with that. We have to be able to figure out then what does each person need to know at a minimum, right? Does it mean that you tell them everything? No, you don't have to tell everybody everything, but you need to tell them the information that's relevant to them. Customers need to know who's going to handle their stuff and how quickly you're going to be able to get to it. Your board of directors needs to know when is business going to be up and running and what are going to be some of the challenges that we're going to face that are going to affect us legally and profitably. Employees want to know, are we going to get paid? Something as simple as that. So we have to figure out what we can share and when we can share it and to whom we can share it. So, crises come in stages. There's sort of the initial shock, and then as we start to gather information, we have more information to share. But again, we want to be careful of not sharing everything that we know blindly, particularly when we're still not clear what it means. That's the problem of being in a situation with ambiguity. We might err on the side of either not sharing enough, which frustrates people, or sharing too much and having a lot of speculation go on, which is not going to help either. So you really do want to have a fine line between too much and not enough. Lastly, again, we want to make sure that your stakeholders have an opportunity to ask questions. So having a hotline or having a situation where people can go to an email website and be able to get their questions answered would be really helpful. 8-hour window. If you capture what has happened, who is impacted, and what you intend to communicate with a clear plan, you have to do this within about an 8-hour window. And if you can get that done in that 8-hour window, you really have a good foundation for good recovery. The first 8 hours are the most critical. Because again, we need to know what's going on. We need to know why it happened, and we need to know how we need to put fires out, figuratively or perhaps literally, and be able to have a plan in place for helping people to recover and move forward. Our next slide, what do we have to think about in terms of that 8-hour window is, first of all, having a fact sheet available. So your spokespeople have something that they can read off of, that they can refer to. They're not speaking off the cuff, because that's a bad plan. So you always want to make sure you've got scripting in place for people to read to the media, to read to next of kin or witnesses or victims. But you want to make sure you've got a fact sheet about all the issues that are important and are relevant and ready to go. And as it needs to be updated, get it updated right away. So your communications people should be focused on what we know and getting that information updated and making sure that those resources are getting sent to the people who can most readily use the help. You want to have somebody who's going to be in contact with law enforcement and other security people to deal with all sorts of things. And you want to make sure that law enforcement knows the facts, what happened, when it happened, what do you think was the cause, because you want to work with them to be able to talk to, if there are victims and survivors' families, we need to be able to communicate through first responders to help us to manage those communications. In terms of your next slide on the 8-hour window, we want to begin to outline a draft response to those big three questions. What did we know? When did we know it? Et cetera, et cetera. So we should have our communications people in place working on these sorts of things. We should also make sure we've got the telephone people or our website people ready to go to be able to answer people's questions as quickly as possible. We need to get messages out to people as quickly as possible. We need to make sure we have a consistent spokesperson. Could this be the CEO? It absolutely could, but it doesn't have to be, right? Sometimes having a spokesperson for you, if it's your communications director, if it's the VP of something, it could be the chairman of the board, it could be anybody along the line that's a representative of the company, but someone that you know has good presence in front of the media, can take questions, can have a calming effect on folks. That's the person that would be ideal for your spokesperson. Moving on to slide 23, as part of that 8-hour window, who are you going to communicate first? Will it be your customers? Will it be your employees? Or will it be the state and local regulators? It depends on the disaster, clearly. If there is, a physical disaster, your employees are your first priority. If it is a ethical disaster or a reputational disaster, you may have to go to state and local officials to deal with the legal ramifications of things. And then the information gets spilled out to your consumers, your employees, your board, and on down the line. And as I said, make sure that you are addressing the needs of each stakeholders. Employees want to know if they're still going to get paid. Customers want to know when their product is going to get shipped or when you're going to show up at their site to deal with the software upgrade that you promised you would do. The media also needs to know because they are informing the community about what's going on. So they have a need to know as well. But again, we want to be careful of making sure that we are not going to the media too soon if we don't have facts to give them. We don't want to go to them with speculation. So slide 24, in terms of the 10 pillars of business community, I think these are great rules of thumb that you should follow. Number 1, respond to customers and victims personally and rapidly. You can never over-communicate to those who've been injured or affected or impacted by a serious incident. Number 2, informing your employees, contractors, and vendors what is expected of them. So they need to know how they're going to be affected, and they need to know what they can do to support you. So it's really important you get that information out there right away. Number 3, launching your off-site IT recovery before system failures force you to do so. So if you know that you've got some instability, fires, local hazards, make sure your off-site IT plan kicks in immediately. Send somebody out to get it managed and up and running, assuming that it's safe to do that. But getting that, cybersecurity is really important for many companies. Item number 4, authorizing your finance department to continue salaries and benefits throughout the disaster is approved by senior management. And this is one of the things that Cantor Fitzgerald did after 9/11 is even though they had a lot of employees that died because that's where the plane hit, one of the planes hit the towers, they continued to pay salary and benefits for a while to all of the surviving spouses of those people, so that there was, for a while, there was at least some continuity. And even for companies that didn't have people who died, they still continued to pay, despite the fact that there may have been a stop in business or a slowdown in business because of the disaster. They still continued to do that, and I think that's important. If you've got deep enough pockets, you can do that. If you have disaster recovery insurance, you can do that, right? You want to make sure, number 5, that contradictions to policies and rumors are kept to a minimum. This is why you don't go forward with information unless you know things to be true. So you can give factual information, but it's really hard when you start speculating on things. You can't speculate. You have to have facts and deal with facts. Number 6, engage a qualified psychological counselor or EAP to offer on-site groups and individual counseling to those impacted by any tragedy. After 9/11, I know that was a big issue in New York. Anybody whose family was affected by the tragedy, anybody who had an opportunity to get counseling was encouraged to go out and get counseling as quickly as possible. Number 7, offering updates to key organizational leaders, investors, and regulators 3 times a day. So a plan for first thing in the morning, midday, and in the evening at the end of the day, letting people know what's going on, what happened, where are we at with progress, what are some known issues, pending issues, and milestones that we've hit. So keeping information going out there, not speculative information, but factual information is really key. Validate that your vendors and suppliers will deliver what you need to accelerate your recovery. So let's say you had a fire or you had a flood. You want to make sure your vendors and suppliers are still going to provide you with things so you can still continue to do business. You can still reach out and get information to your customers. I mean, that's important. Number 9, conduct scenario testing before you declare the disaster over and you resume business. So this may not be in all circumstances, but let's say we've got a problem with a computer glitch. So we can't say, oh, we got it fixed now, and then have the thing break down again. So you want to make sure before you say problem solved, we're back in business, that you have gone through and tested and retested all different kinds of scenarios, that you've pushed your issues to the limits to know that everything is going to be fine. Number 10, conduct a detailed post-crisis assessment of recovery and success, system failures, and opportunities to improve. So people want to know after the event, sort of what's our debrief? You know, how well did we recover? How successful were we? Where did we have failures? Where did we have successes? And how could we improve? So it's always important after a crisis, like anything, right, to evaluate how we responded to it and see what we could do to fix it to be better in the future. So that's the last of the material on crisis management, and I will talk to you soon. Bye.